Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us on the program today is a very unique individual who put together a wonderful book known as 30 Illegal Years to the Strip. We've had him on the program before, and we would consider this to be part 3 of that particular conversation, in which he spent nearly half a century compiling a wonderful story that brought together gangsters who actually came together to bring Las Vegas to all of us here in the world. He's got a very unique perception and definitely a lot of wonderful stories that we're going to be discovering here as to how this particular vision came to light. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Bill Friedman. Bill, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, let's talk about the very unique perception of how Vegas came to be. I mean, you've been in the gaming industry for quite a long time now. What is it about Vegas that makes it so unique, so unlike anything else out there in the world?
Well, in around 1950-51, there was a Senate committee that's gone under the name the Kefauver Committee, and they had no federal power to interfere with local gambling, but they held hearings across the country, and the public, many of whom wanted casinos, when they heard that their politicians and law enforcement officers were taking bribes, a bunch of reform movements began, and they closed practically all of these casinos down. The only center that really remained was Hot Springs, Arkansas, and they had small casinos there for decades after. And that created this enormous, there was an enormous casino player market which now had no source of place to play. So the 4 biggest gangs in Prohibition, after it was ended in 1934, all 4 of them built very elegant but illegal casinos across the country. These were many of those that were closed down. They were very high-end. They were fronted by the finest nightclubs or the finest restaurants in the area. And they knew all their players. They knew the business. They had the staffs to run them. And so these 4 gangs took the profits from Prohibition and the casinos that they'd been running, and they reopened. What made that era unique is not only that gambling was the primary feature along with entertainment, but it was the only time in the state's history where individual properties catered to certain geographical areas. For example, if they had had casinos in Miami or they'd had them in Chicago or Cleveland, each hotel, depending on which owners came out or their associates, that hotel would have a big overload of that percentage of people. Otherwise, it became the gambling and entertainment capital of the world. Every major hotel on the Strip had a showroom and 2 shows a night, almost always at 8 p.m. and midnight. And their stars, the finest singers, dancers, and movie stars, comedians, they'd normally run 3 weeks. So you had all of these showrooms with the top names in America, and they were constantly in rotation. And it was just a phenomenal place to visit. Plus, in the old days, it was the friendliest place you could go into. After you'd been in a casino a couple times, they recognized your name, they called you out, and I started coming here as a child in 54, and I lived through that. And when I went out to dinner at night or to the showrooms when I was 12 years old, I had to have a suit on or I wasn't coming in. And so you can imagine how the women dressed in that era because it attracted the wealthy. And it was just a fun place.
Well, I could imagine it would, and to have that kind of vision, I know as we had you on the show the last 2 times, I decided, to kind of talk about what Prohibition was, who these gangsters were during those times, how their involvement in that particular business was to really supply America with something that it wanted during a time that the government deemed it necessary to say, well, we don't believe that you should have this. It's against the law. And they wanted gambling, but that was against the law as well. And then to take a look at, for instance, the corruption of the lawmakers and the government itself. And, for instance, we talked last time about Tom Dewey and how he certainly was very unfair to one Charles Luciano, but it even continued beyond that. Now, first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit more because your book really predominantly talks a lot about Charlie Luciano, and you begin to see this story unfold from somebody that you really sort of began to champion, so to speak, to realize what this guy really did for America, especially during the war effort, and especially to protect one Tom Dewey. But, the United States, the government itself, just wasn't very nice to a guy that they should have actually awarded medals to.
Well, the politicians of that time and the reformers generally were the worst. When they ran on a reform platform or they needed to build up ratings for an upcoming vote, they'd go after the gangsters. And, of course, things like what became very big after Prohibition was corruption of unions. That was kind of underground. People didn't see that. So they went after the casino operators, and but the irony of it, in almost every case, they would come in and put the current people out and show, yes, they were reformers and they cleaned it up. And as fast as they were closing places down by the group of gangsters in power, they had their own gangsters that had financed their campaign, and they were opening up again, but quieter so it didn't embarrass the reformer. And this happened in city after city, which I present in 30 Illegal Years. This was the standard operating procedure in that era.
Now, it's pretty amazing because I think why these are important things to note for the listener is that it really shapes who these men were that came to build Las Vegas, at least 80% of it. Now, Las Vegas is one of those places that has the allure of easy money. And it's certainly also a place that enticingly plays to all of the senses, it seems, to a person. As you had said the last time we spoke, it's a way to elegantly and I guess strategically separate you from your money. And nobody was really better, it seems, at the vision of something like this than one who gets a lot of credit for the founding of Las Vegas and its idea and its vision than one Ben Siegel. Let's talk about who he is, because he was a prominent figure in all of this and also a very good close friend with one Charlie Luciano.
Well, Siegel was the youngest of the people who went into Prohibition. If you look back at the history of professional crime in America, what we call organized crime really began with Prohibition because the profits were so big. But back into the early 1800s in large cities, in the poor neighborhoods, street gangs would develop, and they were professional in that they made their living at it, but they only exploited the local population, generally of one group that had come in of immigrants. And these gangs, this was a pattern I'd never knew or thought about, but I just looked for patterns. I realized that all the top gang leaders of the 20s, beginning with Prohibition, and so most of them lived into the 60s or 70s, they were all around 20 years old. They weren't all bosses at that point. They were young guys, but they would eventually become bosses. And Siegel was the youngest. He was only 13 years old when Prohibition began. He finished the 8th grade. Prohibition began January 20th in January in 1920. And he finished his 8th grade, and then he went from his home in Brooklyn to join an old friend, Meyer Lansky, on the east side and Lower East Side. And the two of them partnered. They were both Jewish. They partnered with Charlie Luciano, who was Sicilian, and two mainland Italians, Joe Adonis and Vincent Allo, who the world always knew as Jimmy Blue Eyes. It was very hard for me till I met him to figure out what his name was because no one knew it. And the five of them partnered, and here they were, poor kids and very young, and they found the financing to become the biggest importers of fine liquor during Prohibition. Nobody, including them, in my interviews, knew exactly what they brought in because they kept no records, but they were the first biggest group, and the second biggest group, the federal government found a way to find out from their suppliers how much they were bringing in, and at a minimum, they know that the second biggest group was bringing in over 40 million bottles a year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this was huge. They brought their freighters to the international water line. Depending on the era, it was 3 miles or 12 miles. And then they had a huge fleet of high-speed boats that loaded up with all their engines running, everybody carrying shotguns. They shot to shore. They then unloaded and loaded it back onto huge convoys, and they got the financing for all this. That I never found out. I found out who their suppliers were, but I never could find out how they built this empire, which you're talking about some of the greatest achievements in capitalism in history, and these were all kids that basically came out of slums.
You know, and it's so amazing, too, to consider the kind of power and influence these young men had, especially when you consider the shipping docks of the eastern seaboard. And, you know, again, as you're right, that this was actually engaged in to help with the war effort. That's an interesting story just by itself. Talk about the power these guys had when it came to the eastern seaboard and the influence that was incredible enough that even the United States Navy came to them and said, hey, you know, we're having some real trouble here. Is there anything you think you can do to help us out here?
Well, early in the war, it did not look good for the United States. We were shipping primarily out of the New York docks to England to save England from going under with the rest of Europe, because then we would have had no way to attack Germany. And the U-boats, a small submarine that the Germans had, was knocking the freighters from America out at a large rate. And of course, this was, if it was a troop ship, you're talking about a great loss of life. If it was a supply ship, it was either food or armament that was absolutely needed. And they knew that the U-boats had a limited distance they could travel, and the Navy assumed that they were getting information on who was leaving the docks and when they were leaving and what they were carrying. So they wanted to shut it down, and they went to a man who was mafioso, and he headed the city's Fulton seafood market, and it was a huge 3-block enterprise, and most of the fish sold in the Northeast came through there. And they went and they said, can you help us? They most of these people were immigrants. They came from countries because they were oppressed. They did not trust the government. They wouldn't help the Navy. The unions wouldn't let them in. The businesses wouldn't let them in. And they needed help. So they went to this man, and they said, would you help us? And he was under indictment at the time, and he said, let's cut a deal. He did go to prison, and despite it, but he knew all the fishermen, and he got the fishermen to go along, but he told them flat out, there is only one man in America who is so respected by the underworld and by every nationality that if you want to lock up the docks and all the freighter shipping, only one man can help you, and that was Charlie Luciano. He didn't know Charlie, so he couldn't help them. They went to Meyer Lansky, who they knew was close to him and was well known to be a strong patriot and very anti-Nazi, and they asked for his help. And they ended up going with, he was in prison and framed, as I clearly document in the book, framed for a crime that never even committed, to basically life imprisonment. And this is all from official Navy records. The top guys in Navy Intel went with the attorney to Luciano, and they sat in the warden's home with him, and they asked him if he would help. And he flat out said no. And they asked him why. And he said, because if the Axis wins and Germany and Italy had gone into collusion to form the Axis of powers, and then Japan came in with them, and then Italy fell out, he said, if they win, they're going to come get me, and they're going to execute me. Mm-hmm. So he said, I can't be involved. And they said, if we promise never to talk about your involvement, will you help us then? He said, absolutely. So he said, you bring me Meyer Lansky. You tell me what you want. I will pass it on to him, and he will pass it on to everybody else. So they came and told him that they had to lock those docks up in a number of ways. The word was passed down, and 24 hours after Meyer Lansky went back to his former associates, Frank Costello and Joe Adonis and these people, and they went to the unions and to the dock workers, and they said, Charlie Luckey says we're going to war with America. We're all joining this fight. From that day forward, they locked the docks up. When the intel officers arrived later that day, the unions not only let them in, they gave them official documents with false names to protect their identities so they could get into any facility on the docks. The business owners let them check anything they wanted. There was a strike going on. They said, we can't afford to have strikes. This has to go through. The strike stopped that day, and there was never another strike during the war. They said they're getting information about who is going, when, and what they're carrying. Everybody has to stop talking on this dock and report anybody that asks you questions. And from that day on, everybody stopped talking. And if you went to a bar within miles of there, if someone said anything about work, everybody else in the bar would tell him to shut up, and if he didn't understand, they'd take him outside and give him an attitude adjustment. They had absolute control over the docks, and he was the only one who could do it. But he always kept his word. He always negotiated fairly. He understood that both sides have to be unhappy with a deal. To have a good deal, they both have to give up something, or it isn't going to hold. And he was absolutely revered by everybody in the underworld, and in fact the overworld. He was a very soft-spoken man, spoke very quietly and slowly, but even Wall Street, when he talked about issues that needed to be addressed, Wall Street paid as much attention to him as the underworld.
Mm-hmm. You know, and it's so fascinating to realize that particular power was used in such an effective way to actually help the United States and in many ways win World War II. You know, it certainly gave them a leg up because one of the things they were able to do was to glean information about what was going on over in Europe and especially in Italy. And one of the things, for instance, you talked about in the book is that Charlie Luciano, he kind of really didn't want to be deported back to Italy, which is what actually happened as a result of Tom Dewey and the corruptive situation that he put him under with that prostitution charge that caused him to get life in prison. But, well, they discovered, hey, you know, Tom, you did the wrong thing here. And so what he did to acquiesce to that was to say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and pull Charlie out of jail, but I'm going to send him to Italy. And Charlie really didn't want that because of the fear of Mussolini actually having perhaps retribution for his effort in the war.
Well, when he got there, it was right after the war, so Mussolini had gone down. He didn't want to go back because he'd come to America at the age of 7, and he loved Manhattan. He used to walk the streets. It was his city, and he loved everything about it, and he just didn't want to go back. He didn't have friends. He didn't relate to the culture. He knew how to speak Italian, but he didn't relate. And yeah, he was very unhappy with the situation. Very interesting. He was a man just the opposite of what you hear about underworld figures today and being dished in the gangs and these kinds of things. He couldn't see getting into a fight unless you had to protect yourself. So he was infamous. Here he was, the most powerful criminal in the history of the country. He ran Manhattan. He walked the streets, and if he bumped into somebody, he apologized. What was amazing about him, if someone bumped into him, he apologized. Why start everything? And he was known for this. What difference who bumped? Just apologize and move on.
Mm-hmm. You know, and that's the thing about him as he rose to prominence to become the boss of bosses. He abhorred violence. He certainly cast out the rule, we don't take retribution on anybody. Let's just do good business. Basically, they adopted the American business model and what they were doing, even though at the time it was illegal. But yet, there were some strong arms within, I guess, call it the overall gang, so to speak. We talked earlier, for instance, about Al Capone. Everybody knows about this gentleman and what he did in Chicago, basically taking over territories and, had the attitude of, I want as much as I can get a hold of, whereas it was just the opposite with, let's say, Luciano, who believed there was enough for everybody. Now, there was one character, and I thought it was interesting to bring up the Eastern Seaboard, that was pretty much just about as notorious and bad as Al Capone was, and that was one Albert Anastasia.
Yes, he was a frightening figure. I interviewed one of the partners of Luciano, Vincenalo, who, as I mentioned, everyone knew as Jimmy Blue Eyes, and Luciano and his group ended up by not starting gang wars. They ended up pulled into two gang wars between gangs, and they won. So they ended up with the power. Luciano was the boss of bosses, and they had the biggest gang, and it was in New York. The second biggest gang was headed by Anastasia, and he was exactly the opposite. As you said, he was an Al Capone type, horrible bully, tough in a bad way. And I asked Jimmy Blue Eyes what he thought of Anastasia, and remember, this was a lifelong ally and associate of Jimmy Blue Eyes. And Jimmy's face just contorted horribly, and he looked at me and he said, he's the most horrible human being I ever met in my life. And that was one of his close associates. He spoke very poor English, but he was a thug. But they tried to rein him in. They kept preaching their values to him, and they could not eliminate all underworld crime or violence, but they clearly reduced it dramatically. The number of underworld killings during the 25 years that first Luciano was the boss of bosses, and then his lieutenant and close friend, even though he was a competitor for the Manhattan liquor market, Frank Costello, they preached, we don't need the killings, we don't need the law pressure, just find a way to work with each other. And these guys kept trying to negotiate before things blew up.
Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting, too, to realize that there was that kind of power, but that Luciano had a way of reeling it in. And you get the feeling from, as you write here in the book, 30 Illegal Years to the Strip, is that although he didn't want the violence, you kind of sense that underneath it all, he was kind of glad that he had these strong arms there. It was sort of to reinforce in some ways what they were about to do next, which was to create Las Vegas.
And even their life in the underworld, they to set aside, there was 4 groups that built Vegas. One of them was Chicago. It was after Capone, but they were just as ruthless. And then there was the three other gangs, and there's 7 leaders who are the focus of my book. All 3 of them were basically gamblers, and I emphasize that, and because I lived, them and their associates. That was the way I became an adult, was working for them and under the culture they brought with them to Vegas, which I loved. And these guys, gamblers, are unique. They are part of organized crime, but they differ in that organized crime's goal, every type of category we call an organized crime, is to separate you from your money. Now, they want to separate you from your money, but they were different in that they didn't want to physically hurt you.
Right.
And they brought that into the prohibition, and they didn't want to fight with anybody. All of these 7 guys were tough as nails. They couldn't have survived. But as you said, they had to live in this underworld and face all these tough gangs. And when they became the head of the biggest gang, they kept their people in line. And then they had Anastasia backing them up, who was the most psychopathic of the underworld, but he adored them. He lived right near Joe Adonis. He was close friends with these guys. And he was the second biggest gang. Capone's gang was the third biggest. And although he was the most murderous, these 2 guys loved them. So when they got into disputes in the underworld, they had all this firepower backing them up. So they were preaching peace and working towards peace, but they did have that carrot they were holding if this doesn't go right.
Now, I remember earlier in the book that it was interesting because there was a gangster that was talking with someone about stealing. You know, when you think about Las Vegas, and especially for those who have seen the movie Casino, one of the things they really talk adamantly about is how people were always on the take, you know, that lure of easy money, the idea you can put money down and if you hit your number, or if you get the right card, you're going to win, you know, more money than you actually put down. There's an interesting lure, and you play against those odds knowing that the house generally is always going to win. And this is something that you had spent successfully 13 years managing 2 casinos to be extremely profitable, if not the most profitable in Las Vegas. But this gangster was talking about how, you know, stealing's going to occur. Don't get too upset about it. Talk about that a little bit more, because it's really interesting when you think about the psyche of people who go to a place like Las Vegas, you know, to try to find that lure of easy money, getting something for nothing, so to speak.
Okay, well, we've got 2 different groups here. We've got the people who built Las Vegas, and their attitude was, and this includes Ben Siegel, all these key guys that built the town, you don't kill people over money. You only kill people if they're coming after you. And so, and
there's a rule here about killing people.
that was ingrained in these people. And what's interesting, you know, you see the movies and you hear people write about Vegas, and they treat it like there was gang warfare. In the history of Las Vegas, there was only 5 casino owners that were killed, none of them in the state. So anything about the police investigating, they had nothing to do with these crimes. And that will be for a future book, because this is who they were that came there. But there's a question of how many of these were also done by organized crime. People have other enemies in life. And so violence was almost non-existent in Las Vegas in terms of this industry. What was intriguing is Meyer Lansky and Ben Siegel became the first that I'm aware of to tout honest casinos. When they were running illegal casinos, and they had them in Miami and in New Orleans and I'm trying to think of the name, the great horse races there every year. It's right near the capital of New York.
Saratoga.
Saratoga Springs, yes, thank you. And they had these incredible casinos. They always dealt them honest. In fact, in my book, I explain how most of these casinos had seasons. New Orleans ran effectively year-round because they had such a big population around them. But Miami was mainly a winter place where the Northeasterners came to get away from the cold weather, and they would gamble there, where Saratoga Springs only opened casinos in July and August because people wanted to get away as the wealthy went there as a vacation spot. So, but they ran honest games, and one winter, the Jimmy Blue Eyes and Meyer Lansky's casino, they had 1 month, February, where they did terrible. They really took a beating. And a few years later, Jimmy Blue Eyes is sitting with a man who'd become a star by the name of Dean Martin, who was then had the last name Crocetti, and he was a dealer there that year, that winter, when they lost. And he said to him, I got to tell you something. He said, I was part of the crew that ripped you off. They didn't even realize they'd been stolen from. They just knew it was a horrible month. And he told them the truth. And Dean Martin was an incredible card dealer. He could pull any card out of the deck he wanted. He had incredible sleight of hand. And I said, Jimmy, how did you feel about that? He said, we just can't get upset over people stealing. He said, we're not going to do anything about it. And he said, I laughed with him about it at the time, and for the next 40 years, he and I were dear friends. Whenever we were in town, the same town together, we went out for a drink. And the guy who led the gang ended up being the casino manager for Meyer Lansky and Jimmy Blue Eyes, not only in Miami, but then when that was closed down and they went to Havana, Cuba, he was their casino manager. I said, how could you trust him? He says, it was a different world, Bill. He said he gave us his word, and from then on, he wouldn't touch us. And they ran totally legal games and showed the way, because if people never win, they stop playing as much unless they are just totally hooked. And they popularized casinos because they spread the word, deal them honestly.
Mm-hmm. And you think of the fascination behind the idea that you have the potential to win. It's got to be right there at your fingertips. For many of us who have been to carnivals and fairs, you always see somebody who's walking around with a big stuffed animal, and it gives you the idea, I've got a chance to win that. What you don't realize is you're going to lay out more money than the actual thing costs. But that allure of the possibility is what keeps people in the game and playing, even to the point where they're about ready to mortgage their homes and sell off their kids. And it's pretty interesting when you take a look at the odds of something like this happening.
Well, I think there's two types of gamblers. There's the social gambler, like the social drinker, has a little bit moderately and enjoys it, and it's a diversion. And then there's the serious or addicted gambler, which I was and had. That's what made one of the big allures of why I came to Vegas, and I just had to quit one day. I just said, that's enough, it's over. But when you're dealing with the addicted, every one of these people has a fantasy they're living. It can be anything from, if I win, it proves my mother who abandoned me really loves me. I mean, everybody has their own fantasy that they're playing out. I don't believe there's a single person that doesn't believe they'll lose in the long run, but the thrill of the action, as you said, just having the possibility is what it's all about. And I used to bring young executives along with a different philosophy than the older people when I ran my casinos, so I'd take younger talent and develop them, and I'd teach them how to host, and the recognition after winning. The next biggest thing that you can offer a casino player is recognition, to know who he is, to buy him a steak dinner, this kind of thing. But I used to preach to them, because if they weren't serious players, they didn't understand. If someone ask you anything, you respond. But while they're playing, you never interrupt. Hosting is not to be friendly. They are paying a fortune for this fantasy. And you ruin your fantasy, they're going to be very unhappy. So if they say, by the way, can I have a steak dinner afterwards? You say, sure. As soon as you're through playing, come get me. I'll have the slip. But don't sit there and start a conversation. It's the last thing those players want.
Yeah, you want them juiced in.
And another, on your thing, I became the first person to ever advertise the percentage of payout. There'd been a showroom at the Castaways when I inherited it, and we turned it into a restaurant. But they had a good-sized marquee, not as big as the other places, but it was a good-sized marquee. So in huge letters, all I put on it is, we pay 97.4% return, in huge letters. And I actually had bankers, when they would visit, and I dealt with them, they'd say, you know, you've got the most amazing business in the world. You're the only person we've ever seen that can advertise a negative interest rate, and your place is jammed.
Well,
so
you know,
that
and the
relates
allure
to what
too
you say about what the odds really are.
You know, and the thing is that situation is very transparent. You know, you're involved. You're actually the one making the decision to play, versus trustingly putting your money in the bank, where they seem to steal from people a lot worse than anybody in Vegas did.
Well, remember, back then, banks couldn't charge over 6% interest. If you went over 6% interest, that was called usury, and that's what loan sharks did. And loan sharks could go very high, of course, but the general times when people would tell me they owed someone money, it was generally like 2% or 1% a week, you know, which is not trivial, 50% to 100% a year, but it could be a lot less than that, and the banks have gotten up there, you know, into the 20s. That was a long jail sentence for a good part of America's history.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is it about people when they're, you know, at the gaming tables or they come into a casino that makes them believe that, well, I'm going to get around playing the game, and I think there's a possibility that I could just take the money? You know, people seem to get that in their bones, that it's right there within reach, and they feel they can just snatch it. But, you know, Vegas, you got to remember, it was built by people who were street savvy, you know, very smart. You know, there wasn't an angle that you could come into where they didn't know it, you know, and especially as they set up, for instance, you know, in casino, again, I make reference to that because I think a lot of people have, you know, sort of a relation in how Vegas is run is, you know, you had the dealers who were watching the players, you had the pit bosses watching the dealers, and it went on, and then there was the eye in the sky that was watching everybody, that people could actually believe that there is a way to get by. Now, even though Dean Martin and his crew were successful, you know, in dealing and being able to steal from a casino, the fact is, it's not something you're going to be able to do.
Not unless you're highly skilled. When I came in, I started in the business in 1964, and at that time, it was unbelievable the percentage of dealers and executives who, and most people specialized. I was trained by one guy who could do it all. He was phenomenal, and I learned enough to be able to spot it, but never enough to get away with it. And but the percentage of people that knew how to pull any card in the deck or to switch the dice was incredibly high among the employees because they'd come out of illegal gambling. And at that time, the number one thing you looked for in a casino manager was how knowledgeable they were on theft, which almost always meant they were a reformed thief, or they wouldn't have that great eyesight to spot it.
Right.
And that was the thing there had to be. And this is something that I have in the book here. I spent incredible hours with the first two heads of gaming control in Nevada because that was the defining years. They made the policies, they changed the policies, they enforced them. And both men told me, and my research started in '67, and most of my interviews were done by '73, and both of them told me separately, what I'm going to tell you, you can't write about now. This is for later in your life when you're doing more historical writing. They said, we've always maintained the image that we want Nevada clean. By clean, to us, we meant honest. But we knew to make it honest, you had to have a truly smart man at the head of it. So while it appeared that we would knock out everybody who'd been involved in crime, the fact was, what we never said to anybody, is someone running that casino had to have a background in illegal gambling and had to have demonstrated they really knew it, or we tried to block the licenses. The irony is, if someone had been involved in any crime but prohibition or gambling, which of course Nevada had legalized, and so there was no moral issue, we didn't block them, we wanted them. And if they were a legitimate businessman, we wanted them to have one of these boss gamblers running the show. And if they didn't, we tried to stop them, because every time they'd go bankrupt real fast, they'd be ripped off by dealers, they'd be ripped off by players on the outside, and they didn't pay their employees, they didn't pay the purveyors, and so we were trying to stop anyone who didn't know the business. We didn't care about the ownership, we cared about who was running that casino, because we knew it was going to cost our economy if we had to close them down from bankruptcy because they got ripped off.
Mm-hmm. Now, one, as we were talking about earlier, Ben Siegel, who had founded the Flamingo, was somebody who, was really the interesting vision of Vegas, especially with his impeccable, skill, the ability to be able to, his social graces, if you will. But there was a lot that's been written and actually even viewed in Hollywood about who he was. But Ben Siegel, he was pretty much a quiet, sort of a reserved guy. In fact, it was said by one person in your book that he was the kind of guy that couldn't even get laid if he was in a whorehouse. I mean, this is how shy this guy really was, but this was also someone that had tremendous vision when it came to beginning to build the Strip.
He had vision, and yes, although quiet, he had great charisma. He was an incredibly likable man. I have never in my life encountered anyone who had so many people say positive things about them. I got to most of his key executives when Prohibition ended, before he was murdered during that period, that 14 years. He lived in Beverly Hills and in Vegas, back and forth, and I interviewed his key associates in both areas, and he was an incredible businessman, I mean, really effective. He and Meyer Lansky have been portrayed by the early organized crime writers as brain and brawn. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were both very tough guys. They were both very intelligent. The big difference is that Lansky was the abstract thinker and Siegel was the businessman, to the point that if he walked in, people that were associated with him, when he'd be in another city and looking at a business opportunity, if he went into a bank and said he'd like to see the president, as soon as he gave his name, they'd run in and the president would run out. They wanted to do business with this guy. They knew him to be honest, they knew him to be fair, and they knew him to be effective. During the Second World War, and even his closest associates couldn't tell me how he did it. He was bringing in the finest scotches made in Europe past those U-boats somehow, and in Southern California he was supplying the most of the scotch that came into America. Although legal in America now, it was tough to get here and very risky, and he built a huge business out of that, and he got involved in other things.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jimmy Blue Eyes was somebody that you had direct contact with, that you talked quite a bit about, and I liked how you described him earlier in your book, 30 Illegal Years to the Strip, where you said he had this gaze, this penetrating gaze, as though he looked right through you. And I felt that was important because I think all of these guys had that same way. They could read anybody easier than a book. You couldn't get by on these guys at all, could you?
No, and I agree. All of them had street smarts. You couldn't survive in gangland without it. And that I'm in 100% agreement. But Jimmy, and I'm not talking about all of the underworld, but of the people I came in contact with, he was a wonderful man. I knew many people that just revered him, and he was the great peacekeeper for 6 decades. When gangs were ready to go to war with each other, they'd call him in, and he'd go negotiate. If 2 guys were really fed up with each other, and he'd try to bring a peace, and he was really very effective at it. But when I present positions, that he would just stare at me. But I've never seen. I've heard of. There was other people that had it. I felt like he was looking into my soul. The intenseness. It was like he could read it. If anyone was lying to him, I have a feeling they would have become very uncomfortable. For one thing, and I can't reveal it now, I shouldn't be saying, but I solved who killed Siegel. So I sat there, remember this was Siegel's lifelong partner, and I sat there and I was telling him what I'd found. And he just kept staring at me and staring at me. I didn't know if he was going to get angry. I didn't know whether he was going to be offended. I didn't know what, because the stare was so intense. And when I finished, he says, "Bill, you're right, but it took you years to solve it. Me and Meyer had a matter of days. Our lives depended on it. We had to figure out who did it to know, was this a personal hit, in which case it was none of our business, or was this a hit against our group, in which case we had to get these people before they got us." And he said, "So we did in a few days what it took you years to do." And then he said, "And you missed one fact." And he gave it to me, and I will present it in the next book exactly as it happened, that he sat there and added on the final tidbit to very strong evidence.
Mm-hmm. And I think, for our listeners out there, why this is such an important work, first of all, you spent close to a half a century bringing this all together, but of all the true crime books that are out there, they tend to, it's hearsay or a headline here, part of an article there, maybe some direct experience, but you really spent time with direct experience with these people. As I just mentioned, Jimmy Blue Eyes was somebody that you talked with extensively, direct executives with a lot of these people that you feature here in the book. So it isn't a lot of hearsay, and it was mountains and mountains of paperwork, when it came to talk about, for instance, the government and its involvement with the gangsters and the like. And it's really amazing that as a person reads this, they'll realize, the Hollywood movies, as flashy as they are, there's just not a whole lot of truth to what they're really presenting to us.
Yeah, it's I worked very hard, one, to get the information and then to document. I have 41 pages of almost 550 endnotes, so that anybody can go back to the same documents and, one, make sure I'm accurate, and two, know it's there. But what happened before, as you said, I take and analyze each of the early organized crime books in addendums, because most of them have no endnotes. Many of them don't even have an index, and factually they have serious problems, but not except in 2 cases which were proven to be frauds. They never talked to one of the people they wrote about or any of their crime associates. So they only had documents or families who didn't know anything intentionally to protect them. So they really had no sources for their information, and in fact, much of it was just not true. and I don't get into name calling or anything like that. I mean, these were fiction writers who wrote fiction and claimed it was fact. And for the first time, and that's why it took me so long, was to put together what really happened and what these guys are like. The guys that we're talking about didn't act like anything like the thugs in movies, because they were incredibly politically powerful, which is a different story. And the politicians, the law enforcement, they didn't go just bribe people. People came to them because they wanted money. Well, they wouldn't have come to the kind of thugs you see on TV that are bullying everybody. Who's going to go to a bully and put them intentionally in their hands? These guys had a great deal of skill with people and ability to relate to people. They were a whole different breed than Hollywood's had. In fact, Variety, which is an international publication based in Hollywood but covering internationally the movie and TV industry, they did a column on my book about my book, in which one of the great old-time writers for this magazine said, I have created a whole new genre of organized crime because these guys were truly different, and no one's ever picked up on it in writing about them or portraying them.
Mm-hmm. And that's what's really intriguing, to read this and to see the real truth. And you realize, this sure is a lot more entertaining and interesting than the kind of stuff that we see fictionalized.
Yeah, and you can see why people motivated,
right.
Why the culture of Vegas. Remember, I started in '64. These guys were all still there, or their associates were, and I loved that culture. Everybody kept their word. Mm-hmm. There was no violence. It didn't even come up. It's so different than it's portrayed, it's unbelievable.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to Vegas, I know that there was a point where even people who had lived in Vegas for many years say that it was a lot better town when the gangsters ran it. Tell us why that is.
Well, the 7 men of the 3 gangs that primarily built Vegas, Chicago was here in the beginning, but they were just here. They didn't run anything. They didn't become powerful until the era of the movie Casino, and that was about their operations. And however accurate it was, that's what it featured. The 7 leaders that I focus in this book, them and their associates who came and caused the culture of Vegas, they hated violence. They absolutely rejected vendetta, and all 7 of them in the book I show where each one was terribly abused by somebody. If it had gone on, they would kill. If it stopped, they did nothing, even though they had all these hundreds and hundreds of men in each of these gangs they could call upon, taking blood oaths to kill under orders. They never did anything in any of these cases. And they did not believe in monopoly, just the opposite. The FBI has a list of what they call open cities where no crime family can claim control of it. Every one of these cities was opened by either Meyer Lansky or Ben Siegel. When they would go in, they would bribe the politicians, the law enforcement, the prosecutors, and the judges. And then they'd open their illegal casino, and they only went in to open illegal casinos. You would expect them to have their one casino and control the whole thing. In every case, they called up the other gangs and they said, we've opened it up, come on in. These were businessmen. They understood something. If you study the history of casinos in America and around the world, and I've consulted all over the world, and of course been involved in Nevada my whole adult life, if you put one casino by itself, you would think it would do phenomenal. But if you put 5 or 6 casinos there, people want to move between casinos. They want to get different kinds of foods during their visit. If you put 5 or 6 together, each one of them will win more money separately than the one by itself. Mm-hmm. And you combine them, and it becomes phenomenal.
Well, there's that, and the idea that a player believes they need to change their luck. Well, how do you do that? Well, you do that by thinking, well, I'll just change my environment. It just makes sense.
Yeah, and I was part of that. One interesting thing, the four most popular casinos in Nevada in the 50s was in Lake Tahoe and Reno. Bill Harrah had them in both cities, and then there was another casino in both cities, and those were the four busiest. And what was interesting is all four had been built into what was formerly office buildings, and they hadn't ripped all the walls out. So you had little cubicles, in effect, in all casinos, and those were the only four casinos I ever played in that I never left. I would move from room to room to get my change because they had different decors, different spatialities, different feelings. I'd move from room to room, but they were the only ones that I didn't have to leave at some point.
Mm-hmm. And there was a real art to how the casino is actually built and its architecture and design. It's lured to keep people in and going further in, sort of like the maze that says, come to the middle and stay here. And certainly Ben Siegel had that particular vision where, as he built the Flamingo, that all visions actually faced the casino itself. He wanted people gambling.
Yeah, until the mega resort era, which changed everything from so many points of view, until then, the typical casino had the casino as a hub of a wheel. So whether you were coming from parking, from valet, from a restaurant, from a room, from a show, you couldn't get to any other place unless you passed through the casino, and that's called impulse play. And having not only watched it all those years, but experienced it, a lot of times you can walk past a table and or a machine and have no intent to play, and as you go by you think, I wonder if this is my time, and boom, you're into action.
Yeah, and you can't help it either. That impulse gambling can certainly get you, especially if you hit off that first roll of dice. That's what keeps you playing, and that's interesting how those odds work. Even though you know that the odds are stacked in favor of the house, you still have that fighting chance. If I just roll one more time or I hit that card just once more, this is when it's going to pay off. And I know I had a brother that ended up $10,000 in debt because he played 21, and there he was, he had won, but then he stayed in the game thinking he was going to win more. And you got to look at the statistics. If you play those, you can probably be a lot safer than you would be thinking you got a fighting chance.
And you're absolutely right, and there's two types of players, and what you're describing is the addict, which I was, and, obviously you have a problem with that, but there are people there for entertainment value, and I learned that when the poker machine became popular back in the late 70s. I asked people why they had switched from, my customers, why they had switched from slot machines to poker machines. And they had figured out that with a nickel machine, movies were $5 at that time, they had figured out that if they played, they got 2 hours of play for an average loss of $5. And you can't believe the percentage of people, when I asked them why they'd made the switch, they said, well, it cost me the same amount on the average to play 2 hours as to go to a movie. It's more exciting, and there's a chance I'll win $1,000.
And avoid the stale popcorn at the concession.
but there is a group there that knows. They all know they're going to lose, but I mean, they have an entertainment value. It's the only. If you look at the clientele of casinos, it's almost all over 40, vast majority over 50. It's the only exciting thing you can do sitting down, and that is what I learned. If you put a bowling alley on a casino, bowling alley may make you money, but people who bowl, people who dance, people who are active, very small percentage are gamblers. Gambling comes as the only exciting thing to do when you no longer are physically as strong.
And you certainly adopt the life of Jimmy Blue Eyes, who, as I understood, after the age of 19, really never worked a day in his life again. Bill, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program as part 3 of the Free Parters, that people can actually come to see this fascinating era in American history and to really see the American dream being realized in one of the most fascinating ways that anybody can imagine it. The book is 30 Illegal Years to the Strip. Is there a website people can go and they can find out?
Yes, they can get all the background information about the research and the book at Bill, B-I-L-L, Friedman, F-R-I-E-D-M-A-N, author.com. And I'm very shortly going to start a blog to talk about my continued research, my continued writing, and I've gotten some interesting emails from people, and I always ask their permission. I don't put anyone's email address, but I won't even use their name without their permission, and I put their name and city and their question and then my response, and I hope to have that up within a week.
Very good. Bill, again, thank you for joining us here on the program today. It's been a pleasure to talk about 30 illegal years to the Strip. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can discover more also by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-news updates. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well at Beyond50Radio. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, live your day past halfway.